hypothetically, let's say that, what does India need to do according to me? What does the Prime Minister need to do? He needs to try and ensure that some drug company which is Indian can produce cheap testing kits and can produce an effective treatment for the bulk of the serious cases of COVID-19. If we can produce cheap testing kits, well, we have done this before. We have done this in the case of drugs for HIV, for example, HIV/AIDS. You remember, Cipla especially did that.
Right.
And a lot of these big companies, pharma companies in the US and in Switzerland, they were furious. And let's be frank, Bill Clinton now goes around claiming that he solved the AIDS epidemic. Bill Clinton worked very hard to try and sabotage the cure of millions of people in the AIDS epidemic by trying to kill the Indian pharma industry.
Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. This is your host Sri Iyer. After a hiatus of a few months, we have Professor M D Nalapat again on our channel. Professor Nalapat, welcome to PGurus channel.
Thank you, Sri.
Professor Nalapat, we have been watching some turbulence, I should say more than that, in terms of the global markets because of the disturbances caused by the coronavirus. And some people insist on calling it Chinese virus. Be that as it may, we can stay with COVID-19 if you would like. I leave it to you to choose what you want to term it as. It can be China virus. Now, what we are seeing is a tremendous amount of gut-wrenching in terms of the market going through a lot of turbulence in United States to start with, and in other countries, because more or less United States is where the stock market rules the way the direction the economy is headed. Sir, what is, in your opinion, the value of the brand China? It seems like it is taking a hammering right now.
Well, yes, that's may I say, Sri, that this is only one part of the story. And so far as China is concerned, in my view, for what has been happening over the past several years is a clear separation between China and the United States in terms of logistics chains, in terms of, for example, defense and security. And frankly, now you had in the past a Soviet bloc and an American-led bloc. And now you have an American-led bloc and a Chinese-led bloc. So what you're seeing is an accentuation of an already existing trend that is separating the two blocs. And just as the Soviet bloc became more and more separated economically from the other bloc, in my view, in the future, the two blocs are going to also start separating, although it doesn't look like it now because there's so much of dense interlinking between, for example, the United States and China.
Well, sir, if you look at the numbers that are coming out of the Senate package, there's a $2 trillion bailout being planned by the Senate, and the Federal Reserve has just announced that they are going to have an open-ended quantitative easing. They've already released 800 billion. It might go all the way up to 3 trillion. So if you total that up, that's 5 trillion. And the US is a $20 trillion economy. That means US is now pledging close to 25% of its output in terms of incentives. And one of the incentives that I am hearing is that across the board, small and medium businesses are going to be given a 3-month salary window, and essentially they would go on furlough from their existing jobs. For 3 months, they would get paychecks from the government, and then they would be restored back to what their original jobs are. The numbers that are being bandied out, $5,000 per family, and you need to be making less than 150,000. This is just a starting point. I suspect that might get lowered. Now, in China, what I have heard is that as this Chinese virus started spreading, many of the foreign companies who had equity stakes in the Chinese division of their operations, or even Chinese companies that they are invested in, they had pulled their money out. Now, if that is the case, essentially it means that United States, the corporate America, has lost confidence in China's ability to weather such kind of storms in the future. What are your thoughts on that, and what do you think India should be doing at this point?
Well, I'd like to say that this is an opportunity for India, for the simple reason that a lot of global supply chains are now realizing that concentrating their manufacturing exclusively in one country, how risky it is. You're seeing a complete lockdown in China. Now that lockdown is partially being removed, but the reality of the situation is something else may come. You had SARS. I mean, you had bird flu. You had swine flu. Now you've got the COVID. So the reality of the situation is that concentrating so much of manufacturing for the global supply chain in one country is a vulnerability, and therefore there's now a conscious effort to shift that supply chain out of China. It was already happening for the simple reason that geopolitically there was increasing distance between the US and China. For example, US sanctions on China. So it started actually with Trump's initiation of a trade war with China. Then it is accelerating now as a result of this COVID-19 crisis.
Well, see, for the Chinese, when they started out manufacturing, one of the big helpers for them was that small island across the straits called Taiwan. Taiwan invested big into China, and by way of manpower, what they did was, their top management took turns. I'm talking about the 1990s, early 2000s. They took turns, running their subsidiary units in mainland China. Mainland China opened the banks to them. They could set up whatever they wanted there. That's how you saw all these semiconductor fabs that came up in Shanghai area, and also the area just outside of Hong Kong, the Shenzhen area. I remember driving through all those places and seeing most of them were people who had, either studied in US and settled back in Taiwan. These were the guys who got the Chinese up and running. I'm talking about 15 years ago, for which now China has become such a big economy. Now, if you take the same situation and try to put it across to other possible countries where production could move to, for example, India, what would be the foundations that India would need? For example, I can think of NRIs moving back to India to try and get that high level of infrastructural quality. I'm not talking about quantity. India has plenty of quantity. It is the quality of the output that needs to be ensured. Do you think India, the government in its current fiscal stimulus package, is it going to open put the red carpet out for NRIs such as myself? And I have a lot of ideas, but I'm deadly afraid of coming into India and putting up a new plant because of the tax terrorism that exists right now.
Well, Sri, let me go to Taiwan first. And the fact is that about a little over 4 years ago, Tsai Ing-wen of the DPP was elected the president of Taiwan. And the Chinese started distancing themselves from Taiwan. And they started talking to the Taiwanese businessmen who are based in China. And I think they kind of leaned on them to support this eventual unification project of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the Taiwanese businessmen were caught in a dilemma because on the one hand, they're Taiwanese, and at the same time, many of their companies had the United States, Japan, and other markets separate from China. And secondly, they didn't want to get involved in politics. Most Taiwanese businessmen don't want to get involved in politics. So I think by injecting politics of unification into the Taiwanese business community, from that time, the Taiwanese business community is, I think, looking for a sharp reduction in its investment in China. I agree with you, it is a very significant reduction. But today, of course, the reality is, in those days, China didn't have the expertise. They didn't have people who were, cognizant of international finance. Today, the Chinese have ramped up that in a huge way. Chinese studying abroad are very much more than Taiwanese studying abroad, or even, our own people studying abroad. And as a consequence now, the delinking has started. It was initiated by the Chinese side, and that has been a blessing for Taiwan because now with this COVID outbreak, Taiwan is relatively unscathed. It very quickly cut a lot of the links with China. It was one of the first locations to completely cut off a lot of the linkages with China. And this is a country where about 2 million Taiwanese have married, Chinese women, and about 2.5 million Taiwanese work in China. Despite that, they managed to cut a lot of the linkages, with the result that they have very low rate of infection of this very highly infectious virus. Yes, the Taiwanese are interested in India. She's a very liberal, modern individual. She's a global citizen, and she loved India. And frankly, she has been trying to focus a lot on India. So what India needs to do, I think, is to have dedicated industrial parks for Taiwanese businesses, because Taiwanese businessmen, they want to congregate together. They want a little Taiwan where they're located. And Taiwan, the MSMEs are quite big. It's not that you have the giant industries like Foxconn only. The real driver of growth in Taiwan are the medium industry and also small industry. So you have parks where medium industry, large industry, and some small industry that are Taiwanese can come together. And for that, I think you need to ensure that the government can work out this kind of a location where the Taiwanese feel at home. We've got competition from Vietnam, we have competition from Cambodia, we've got competition from Myanmar. And these are three countries that are really paying a lot of attention to investment from Taiwan.
Well, I can speak from experience of having dealt with many companies in Taiwan. There are two main units. This is a few years ago. My information could be a little bit dated right now, but they have two big cities called Hsinchu and Taipei itself, which is where most of the electronics industry, startup ecosystem, what have you, used to exist in Taiwan. And I think you're absolutely right that India can establish an industrial development park for Taiwanese investments. And I can tell you in no time at all, India can be a powerhouse in being able to supply the needs of the world. There's no reason why India cannot achieve the miracle that was achieved by the same Taiwanese engineers in China. In fact, I would go even further to say that, create export processing zones for NRIs too. We know what we need to do in India to get it up and running. Where things get bogged down is that when you bring investment in to the tune of millions of dollars, you need to be able to take out the profits too. You cannot just keep on flowing it in. It's not a philanthropic idea. It has to be a business opportunity. And somewhere there, India seems to have lost the plot. For example, Vodafone. And what is going on there? Why can't India finish that deal one way or the other and move on? Do you have any update on that, sir?
Well, I'd like to say that one of the problems that India faces, and frankly, Prime Minister Modi got it right when he talked of minimum government, is the fact that an official in a ministry, for example, can do an enormous amount of damage to an entire industry, much less an industrial unit. Files in India go up and down the system, and an official who puts in a particular kind of noting can delay a project, perhaps even indefinitely. So yes, this is a problem, and we do need to ensure that there is much greater transparency. The problem, officials can do this for two reasons. Let's say, for example, today in India, let's say, hypothetically, let's say that, what does India need to do according to me? What does the Prime Minister need to do? He needs to try and ensure that some drug company which is Indian can produce cheap testing kits and can produce an effective treatment for the bulk of the serious cases of COVID-19. If we can produce cheap testing kits, well, we have done this before. We have done this in the case of drugs for HIV, for example, HIV/AIDS. You remember, Cipla especially did that.
Right.
And a lot of these big companies, pharma companies in the US and in Switzerland, they were furious. And let's be frank, Bill Clinton now goes around claiming that he solved the AIDS epidemic. Bill Clinton worked very hard to try and sabotage the cure of millions of people in the AIDS epidemic by trying to kill the Indian pharma industry. Now, I don't see any reason why Indian companies, maybe 1 dozen, 2 dozen drug companies who are Indian, cannot individually and some of them jointly join hands to see if we can produce testing kits at low cost and we can produce some kind of a cure at low cost. I mean, I'm not really going to, this obsession with the WHO. WHO, Sri, quite frankly, I'm very disappointed in the WHO. For example, they were clearly informed by scientific authorities that human to human transmission had started taking place in China. And that information came from Taiwan. It took 2 weeks for them to publicly say human to human transmission is possible. 2 weeks. In these 2 weeks, countless people would have been infected. Countless lives have been lost because we lost these 2 weeks. So the WHO from day one has been lagging behind this particular crisis. And now they're talking about be very careful about what drugs you're going to test. I mean, we're talking of laboratories in India which are famous for exporting drugs across the world. Do you think laboratories, pharma laboratories in India that have got markets across the world going to give quack remedies? Of course not. So my view is, let's ensure that Indian companies are given much more latitude to look for these solutions. Today, anything that you need to do, you need to go through a very, very, very small regulatory prism. You have to go through the eye of the regulatory needle. And as a consequence, many companies want to go ahead with trials. They're not really got permission to do so. Many companies want to go ahead with test kits. They have not got permission to do so. Now look, I'm not saying anything, Sri, but the reality of the situation is foreign drug companies will be delighted at this because they would like to flood India with expensive testing kits and flood India with expensive medicines for COVID. They're already flooding India with a lot of expensive stuff. And they would like to do it in the case of this as well. And, vaccines, for example. Yes, we are producing vaccines. But a lot of those vaccines, the profit, where does it go? It doesn't go to India. It goes outside India. So I would like to say, Sri, I hope, Sri, you and I have a very high opinion of Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Yes.
He's an outstanding individual who has done so much for the country and has changed perceptions of India in the whole world. What he needs to do now is to ensure that Indian companies, Desi companies, are allowed to test both testing kits for COVID-19 as well as possible remedies for COVID-19. Don't forget, the day you have a remedy for COVID-19 and the number of deaths can be significantly brought down, COVID-19 becomes the common cold. It becomes not an existential threat, but a minor nuisance, frankly. And that's what needs to happen. So look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump has opened the field to US companies for testing in vaccines, in production of drugs, and in test kits. Xi Jinping has done the same in China. Now, we need to do the same in India. Do you think Indian brains are less than Chinese brains or American brains? Do you think Indian companies are less responsible than Chinese companies or American companies? Of course not. But then the problem is our system is geared towards regulation by very narrow bands of authorities. And naturally, these people are swamped by overwork and they can't pay attention to all the requests that are coming through to them. And permissions get delayed for months and months.
That is an ongoing concern. I think some of these things have to be taken away. All these cobwebs have to be removed. There's an opportunity for India right now to lead the world out of this pandemic by coming up with an effective, low-cost medication for this pandemic. I'm sure somebody is going to come up with the cure, and sometime you're going to have to come up with quick vaccines as well as long-term cure. And this is an window of opportunity for India. Let's hope that Prime Minister Modi sees his way clear through cutting through some of this red tape and making sure that those of the pharma companies that are able to do this, and I'm absolutely in agreement with you, the pharma companies in India are very, very highly respected, and they can deliver wonders to the world, and they can take the leadership in trying to be the pharma solution provider for the whole world, just like Taiwan is for plastics in the whole world. So India needs to hang its hat on something, and I think they should go look no further than pharma. Pharma is a great place to establish yourself as the leading provider. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, Professor Nalapat.
I'd like to say, Sri, very clearly that you're perfectly right. And the reality of situation is we did that for HIV/AIDS. It's because of Cipla, an Indian company, that a cost of AIDS was completely rendered into a very reasonable level. And we can do this for COVID-19. Now, the problem is our system is such that, a foreign company, in an entire organization of very reputable people, one or two people who are somehow influenced can then, upset the entire apple cart.
Yes.
Because in our system, it's even one weak link in the chain and the whole chain grinds to a halt. This is the problem. And don't tell me that these companies are not working on that. These big foreign companies that are basically salivating at making billions of dollars from India. They're looking at whom they can buy, whom they can influence, so that they can sabotage Indian companies. The Prime Minister really needs to pay attention to this. India must produce the cheapest testing kits for the whole world. India must produce the most effective and low-cost medicine for COVID-19 for the whole world. We can do it. We must do it.
Absolutely, sir. I couldn't agree with you more. And with that, we hope that India also comes up with an effective economic package. I don't know what shape and form it is going to be, but we will be back discussing that once Indian government releases the details. Thank you very much, Professor Nalapat.
Thank you. Thank you, Sri.